England did not crumble under the Vikings because they were stronger. It crumbled because it was exhausted. By 1016, the land had traded peace for gold so many times that peace itself had become meaningless. Kings promised safety, then scrambled to survive. Armies assembled only to vanish. Loyalties shifted faster than the coins leaving the treasury. England was a kingdom running on fumes. Then came a man history would remember as Canute the Great. He did not arrive as a hero. He arrived as a force England could no longer resist, a threat dressed in resolve and strategy. And yet, for nearly 20 years, this outsider ruled with a precision that England's own kings had long failed to achieve. Trade flowed steadily, justice returned, order, the kind that made life predictable, re-emerged. But here lies the paradox. If Canute's rule was so effective, why did it all unravel almost as soon as he died? This is not merely a tale of Viking conquest. It is the story of how skill and vision can tame chaos, and why even brilliance alone cannot make power permanent. To grasp Canute's story, we must first step into the England he inherited. This was a kingdom hollowed out by fear. For decades, Viking raids had swept across the land, not chaotic violence, but deliberate pressure, calculated to break will. England's response was not defiance, but payment. Danegeld, silver sent north in hopes of buying temporary mercy. At first, it seemed to work, but over time, it taught the wrong lesson. England became less a fortress than a treasury. Kings held titles, but not true command. Nobles guarded their lands, not loyalty to the crown. The idea of united defense quietly eroded, leaving cracks invisible until they could no longer be ignored. This was not a failure of swords or shields. It was a failure of judgment. By the early 11th century, England was wealthy, fractured, and uncertain. Across the North Sea, ambitious eyes watched patiently. Canute did not create this crisis. He arrived precisely when the kingdom could no longer avert it, and in that moment, history began to bend toward him. England once thought it had mastered the art of power. Under capable rulers, laws functioned, violence retreated, and the crown seemed unshakable. Confidence ran deep until it didn't. When leadership faltered, the foundations it relied on began to crumble. Kings leaned on reputation rather than preparation. When danger loomed, they bargained, delayed, and negotiated, believing that crisis could always be postponed. Over time, this bred a subtle but deadly expectation. That problems could be managed tomorrow, that threats were always someone else's responsibility. But history is unforgiving. Time does not pause for hesitation, and it does not reward delay. By the time Canute stepped onto England's stage, resistance had become almost performative. Armies gathered too late. Alliances fractured too early. Nobles hesitated when unity was required. The kingdom itself endured, yet the belief that it could withstand true upheaval had thinned to a whisper. In that fragile moment, Canute arrived not as a conqueror chasing victory, but as a force confronting a nation that had forgotten how to defend itself. The stage was set for a transformation that would echo across decades and reshape England forever. The problem was never cowardice. It was disunity. England's nobles ruled in pockets, governing their own lands while loyalty drifted sideways, never upward. When danger struck, every leader hesitated, waiting for another to move first. That very hesitation became deadly. Viking commanders understood a truth England's kings overlooked. In a crisis, unity can outweigh legitimacy. A single, decisive leader, even a foreign conqueror, could outperform a fragmented native elite. Strength mattered, but coherence mattered more. Canute would later exploit this weakness with ruthless precision, turning hesitation into opportunity and indecision into conquest. Every fragmented alliance, every delayed response, became a foothold for his expanding power. But before that could happen, England had to lose something far more vital than land or treasure. It had to lose faith in itself. Only when confidence faltered and old loyalties dissolved could a foreign hand take the reins and reshape the kingdom in ways that would endure for decades. The stage was set. Fragmentation had weakened England, and Canute was ready to step into the gap. Canute was not born into peace. He was born into opportunity. The Viking world was not chaos. It was a crucible of competition. Kingship was earned through action, not inheritance. Authority endured only as long as it was asserted and defended. In such a world, decisiveness mattered more than tradition, and hesitation was a fatal flaw. From a young age, Canute witnessed power seized, not granted. He saw victories won and thrones taken, understanding that leadership demanded both vision and ruthless execution. His father, Svein Forkbeard, recognized England's vulnerability long before most. He saw a rich island, its wealth unguarded, ruled by kings who hesitated and nobles who looked out for themselves. To Svein, invasion was not reckless, it was inevitable, even logical. Canute absorbed these lessons deeply. Every story of conquest, every calculated strike, every shift in loyalty became part of his understanding. He learned that opportunity favors those who act, and that a kingdom divided can be mastered by a single, decisive hand. By the time he would set foot on English soil, Canute was more than a Viking prince. He was a strategist forged by observation, ready to turn England's hesitation into his advantage. Where England hesitated, Scandinavia moved forward. Young Canute quickly understood a vital truth. Delay was not caution, it was surrender. Mercy without leverage carried no weight. Fear could be managed, calculated, and even turned into loyalty. But indecision was fatal. This stark contrast in political culture would shape the man he became and define every choice of his reign. While England wavered, distracted by tradition and fragmented loyalties, Canute absorbed the lessons of action, decisiveness, and strategy. He learned that authority was not granted by titles alone, it had to be exercised with precision and foresight. When he later ruled England, he did not impose a foreign identity. He did not attempt to remake the kingdom into a Scandinavian mirror. Instead, he made it functional. Laws worked, trade flowed, nobles respected authority, chaos was contained, and order, tangible, effective order, returned. That was his genius, the subtle understanding that governance is less about culture or conquest and more about results. This distinction between power exercised wisely and power inherited poorly changed everything, leaving a legacy that would endure long after his death. In the year 1013, England finally broke, not with a roar or a battle, but with a quiet, almost humiliating surrender. Svein Forkbeard, king of Denmark and father of Canute, crossed the North Sea with an army ready for resistance. Instead, doors opened. Town after town yielded without a fight. Local leaders swore allegiance not because they admired Svein, but because they had lost faith in their own king. Ethelred had ruled through fear, bribery, and negotiation for so long that obedience had become optional. Confidence had evaporated. London resisted briefly, a stubborn flicker of hope. Everywhere else, England gave way. This was not conquest in the traditional sense. It was recognition, a realization that the old order could no longer safeguard its people. Survival now meant aligning with the master who promised the least destruction. By Christmas of 1013, Svein Forkbeard was acknowledged as King of England, not crowned, not celebrated, simply accepted. And in that quiet, reluctant acknowledgement, England crossed a threshold it could never fully retreat from. The kingdom had shifted, and the stage was set for a new power to rise, a power that would change the course of its history forever. Svein's reign lasted barely 5 weeks, long enough to prove that England could submit. Not long enough to reveal what stable rule might look like. Early in 1014, Svein Forkbeard died suddenly. No climactic battle, no grand execution, just absence. And with that absence, the fragile new order collapsed almost instantly. The English elite reverted to their old habits. Ethelred was welcomed back from exile. Promises were made, reforms debated. Oaths renewed as though loyalty could simply be reset on command. But something essential had shifted. England had demonstrated, in no uncertain terms, that kingship could be negotiated, that authority was conditional. That obedience was never guaranteed. Canute, still young, withdrew with his father's army, not in defeat but with understanding. He had seen the kingdom bend. He had observed how swiftly allegiances could change. He had witnessed the delicate threads holding English unity together, threads that could unravel at the faintest pull. And from this retreat, a lesson crystallized. To conquer England, one had to understand its fragility and exploit it with precision. Ethelred's return did not restore stability. Instead, it exposed just how fragile authority had become. The king promised to rule differently, to listen, to reform, to defend the kingdom with strength. But credibility, once broken, cannot be easily repaired. Nobles remembered betrayal. towns remembered surrender, the people remembered fear. England existed in name, but belief in it had all but vanished. Meanwhile, Canute did not vanish into history. He returned to Scandinavia not to grieve, but to plan. He forged alliances, secured fleets, and assembled an army larger, more disciplined, and better prepared than the one his father had commanded. He had learned that hesitation invites chaos, and that half measures achieve nothing. The lesson of 1013 had been clear. England could be taken. The lesson of 1014 was sharper. It had to be taken completely. Partial victories only sowed disorder. True order demanded total control. Canute understood that leadership is as much about decisiveness as power. He would not repeat his father's mistake. This time, there would be no retreat. There would be no ambiguity, only a conquest executed with precision and a kingdom transformed under his command. In 1015, Canute returned to England. This was no raid, no impulsive strike. This invasion carried purpose, precision, and patience. Canute came as a claimant, not a plunderer, a man who understood the fragile state of English politics and knew exactly how to exploit it. Ethelred's reaction was familiar. Delay, negotiation, hesitation. Every moment of indecision gave Canute the advantage. By the time England's forces assembled, the initiative had already slipped through their fingers. Then in April 1016, Ethelred died. Once again, England stood leaderless at its most vulnerable hour. The throne passed to his son, Edmund, later remembered as Edmund Ironside. Unlike his father, Edmund was courageous, energetic, and unafraid to meet his enemies in battle. But courage alone could no longer save a kingdom. The system around him was fractured. Nobles acted independently. Loyalties were conditional. Authority was weakened. England's very foundations were fragile. Bravery could inspire, but it could not repair the broken structures Canute had observed. And Canute, patient and relentless, was already waiting, ready to turn England's fractures into his advantage, and to seize what hesitation had left unprotected. Edmund Ironside fought with a ferocity few had anticipated. In 1016, England did not bow quietly. Battles erupted in rapid succession, victories celebrated, losses endured, and for the first time in years, the kingdom resisted with genuine force. Yet resistance without unity is a fragile thing. Edmund could win on the battlefield, but he could not command loyalty everywhere at once. Some nobles supported him fiercely. Others hesitated, waiting to see which side would emerge victorious. A few quietly plotted to shift allegiance when the moment came. Canute observed it all with patient calculation. He understood that mastery of a kingdom was not measured in every victory, but in endurance, strategy, and the ability to exploit fracture. By autumn, both armies were spent. England was bleeding, so was Canute's force. And then, in a move as pragmatic as it was remarkable, they negotiated. The kingdom was divided. Edmund retained Wessex. Canute took the rest, a compromise born of exhaustion, not idealism, temporary, uneasy, and fragile. And yet, it revealed the lesson that would guide Canute's future. True power is measured not by battles alone, but by the patience and precision to outlast your enemy. The division of England was meant to halt the bloodshed. Edmund Ironside retreated to Wessex, the historic heart of English kingship. Canute claimed the rest. On paper, it seemed balanced. In reality, it was only a temporary pause, a fragile interlude before inevitability. Edmund was young, drained, and surrounded by uncertainty. His authority rested on men who had already betrayed his father. Every decision was perilous. Every delay bred doubt. Then, only weeks later, Edmund died. How exactly remains uncertain. Illness, battle wounds, sudden collapse, history does not tell us clearly, and that ambiguity itself matters. What followed was striking in its quiet. There was no uprising, no desperate rebellion, no final stand. England did not erupt in fury, it went still. With Edmund gone, the last spark of native resistance vanished, not with defiance, but with reluctant acceptance. Nobles did not contest the throne. Armies were not raised. They turned inevitably to the figure who remained, Canute, not because they adored him, not out of allegiance, but because he was there, steady, patient, and unopposed, while everyone else had vanished. In early 1017, Canute was acknowledged as king of all England, not crowned in fanfare, not celebrated with cheers, but accepted in quiet resignation. The kingdom had been stretched to its limits. Years of fear and fractured leadership had reshaped instinct. Stability mattered more than heritage, order outweighed identity, and survival surpassed pride. Canute recognized the moment with sharp clarity. He did not rely on ceremony to assert legitimacy. He claimed it through decisive action. His first moves were precise, unflinching, and calculated. Rivals vanished. Potential threats were neutralized. Some were exiled, others executed. The message was not cruelty for its own sake. It was unmistakable clarity. The chaos was over. For the first time in decades, England knew exactly who ruled and what defiance would cost. Fear returned, but now it was structured, predictable, and paradoxically comforting compared to the uncertainty of years past. Canute was not loved, but he was obeyed, and after generations of betrayal, compromise, and collapse, obedience felt like relief. The kingdom could breathe again, not free, but stable, and for a moment that was enough. Canute's early reign was not gentle. It was deliberate. He understood a truth England's previous rulers had long forgotten. Peace must be enforced before it can be trusted. To achieve it, he removed those most likely to threaten it: earls with divided loyalties, families with claims to the throne, warriors whose power thrived on disorder. The violence shocked the kingdom. But it also resolved something that had festered for years: ambiguity. There was no doubt about who held command, no rival kings, no promises hanging on uncertain loyalty, only one authority, clear and unchallenged. Then, almost unexpectedly, Canute paused. Executions ended, purges slowed. In their place, a new rhythm returned: routine. Courts reopened. Taxes were collected with consistency. Trade began to flow again. Fear had paved the way, but it would not form the lasting structure. Canute had no desire to rule forever through terror. He was building something subtler, more enduring, a system stronger than violence alone could achieve. And in that careful balance between authority and stability, the kingdom began to transform under a ruler who understood that true power lies not only in conquest, but in control. Most conquerors govern as outsiders. Canute chose a different path. He preserved England's laws, not Danish edicts, not Viking customs, but the familiar Anglo-Saxon codes that had endured for generations. He retained English administrators. He safeguarded institutions that people trusted. This was not an act of mercy. It was strategy. Canute understood that authority imposed from outside rarely survives. True stability comes from continuity, from the sense that life goes on even under a new ruler. When people feel the system endures, loyalty follows more readily than fear ever could. Then he made a move that erased lingering uncertainty. He married Emma of Normandy, widow of Ethelred. This was more than a political alliance, it was a deliberate transformation. By joining England's former royal line, Canute blurred the distinction between conqueror and king. The past, once a rival, became a foundation for his rule. Suddenly, Canute was not replacing England's leadership. He was seamlessly continuing it, and a kingdom exhausted by betrayal and upheaval accepted the illusion, welcoming a ruler who could claim both victory and legitimacy, fear and trust in the same breath. Something unexpected unfolded under Canute's rule. England began to calm, not instantly, not flawlessly, but tangibly. Raids dwindled, roads grew safer, coinage stabilized. Justice, still uneven and sometimes harsh, returned with a rhythm people could recognize. For those who had endured decades of fear and upheaval, the change felt extraordinary. Canute ruled with firmness, yet never recklessly. Rebellion was met with swift and uncompromising punishment. Loyalty was rewarded, often generously. But above all, he was consistent, predictable, reliable. Predictability, it turned out, became his greatest weapon. The people had feared chaos more than they had feared foreign kings. By offering stability, Canute did something no conqueror before him had achieved. He transformed fear into order and uncertainty into trust. Gradually, the label Viking King began to fade. He was no longer just an outsider or invader. He was simply the king. And in that quiet, persistent authority, England discovered a strange comfort, the comfort of knowing who ruled, and that for the first time in decades, they might survive intact under that rule. But stability can be an illusion. Canute's England functioned, not because the system was strong, but because he was always present. He balanced fear with restraint, intervened before minor issues escalated, and ensured that order was maintained. This was not institutional resilience, it was personal authority. The kingdom did not run itself, Canute ran it. Every court, every dispute, every potential rebellion was managed under his watchful eye. And that difference between true structural stability and the will of a single ruler mattered more than anyone could appreciate at the time. From the outside, England appeared calm, orderly, even prosperous. But beneath that surface, fragility remained. The peace was contingent, dependent on the king's presence and judgment. The warning was subtle but inevitable. Once Canute was gone, the kingdom would face the test it had long postponed. For now, however, he stood at the center of a realm that, after decades of chaos, finally seemed at rest. A kingdom held together not by law alone, but by the precise and unyielding authority of a single man. Canute was never entirely English, nor was he merely Viking. He governed between worlds, navigating identities with careful precision. He attended church, funded monasteries, and presented himself as a Christian king, chosen by divine authority. Yet beneath the piety and ceremony, he never lost sight of the source of his power. Ships remained ready at his command. Warriors stayed loyal. Force lingered quietly behind every law, every decree, every promise. This balance between diplomacy and intimidation, faith and force, made him remarkably effective. He could inspire obedience and enforce order without overt tyranny, yet it also set him apart. Canute was respected, feared, and followed, but always a step removed. The weight of the kingdom rested squarely on his shoulders. He had no equal, no counterpart who could share his burdens or replicate his authority. He ruled between worlds, between cultures, between law and power. And in that duality lay both his strength and his isolation. He was a king in every sense, yet he ruled alone. Canute's success was born from observation, not mere ambition, not from his own failures, but from England's. He watched indecision unravel kingdoms, witnessed weak rulers invite chaos, and saw how endless negotiation drained authority and eroded respect. He absorbed these lessons and ruled with clarity, decisiveness, and a calculated restraint that few had mastered before him. Where previous kings had reacted, Canute anticipated. Where others begged for loyalty, he commanded it. And where violence had once exploded uncontrollably, he wielded it sparingly, with intent, and always in service of order. He did not seek to remake England in his own image. He sought to stabilize it. The kingdom did not suddenly grow stronger in battle or wealth, but it became quieter, safer, more predictable. Roads were less dangerous, markets flowed, courts functioned. Life, which had been battered by uncertainty and fear, began to resume its rhythm. In that quiet, Canute's mastery became evident. He had not simply conquered a land, he had reshaped it, not through relentless terror, but through the patient, deliberate application of authority that transformed chaos into endurance. But beneath the calm, a quiet danger lingered. England functioned not because it was strong, but because Canute was always present. Every law enforced, every dispute settled, every threat managed, all depended on him. There was no clear plan for succession, no system capable of self-correction. Loyalty flowed to a man, not an institution. Authority was concentrated in a single, unyielding hand. The kingdom was balanced, not built. Its stability was an act of careful maintenance, not the product of enduring structure. And balances, no matter how skillfully maintained, are fragile. They do not warn you before they fail. They crumble silently. They collapse not with noise, but with absence. Canute's presence held everything together. His insight, discipline, and authority prevented chaos, but once he was gone, the threads would loosen. The quiet order that England had grown to rely on would falter, and the kingdom would confront a test it had never truly faced: survival without the hand that had guided it. The calm was real, but it was precarious, dependent, and temporary. For now, England rested. The raids had stopped. Fear had taken form and limits. The future, once uncertain and chaotic, now seemed manageable. Canute had accomplished something rare. He had made conquest feel seamless, almost natural. England did not feel occupied, it felt ordered. Continuity masked the presence of a foreign hand, and for the first time in decades, life began to breathe again. But history is rarely gentle with fragile solutions. The calm Canute created depended entirely on his judgment, his vigilance, and his restraint, qualities that could not be transferred, inherited, or replicated by anyone else. The kingdom's stability was personal, tied to the man who wielded authority with precision and foresight. And one day, sooner than anyone could anticipate, England would pay the price for mistaking calm for true strength. For now, the kingdom appeared secure, but beneath the surface, the seeds of uncertainty had only been paused, not removed. The peace was deliberate, not permanent. The order was maintained, not built. Canute's legacy was extraordinary, but England would soon learn that even the most carefully balanced power cannot endure without a hand to guide it. For the first time in a generation, England could breathe without its king overseeing every action. And that alone revealed how profoundly the kingdom had changed. Canute no longer needed to remain constantly at the center to maintain order. His authority had become entrenched. Resistance had faded into memory. The kingdom functioned on its own, courts administered justice, taxes were collected reliably, and nobles followed his decrees. With that foundation, Canute did something no English king before him had dared. He left. This was not recklessness or neglect. It was a statement of confidence. Canute trusted that England could sustain itself, at least temporarily, and he had ambitions that extended far beyond the island. England was merely one piece in a grander design. The North Sea, once a boundary, was now a highway. Control of its shores, its fleets, and its trade routes meant influence across kingdoms, across waters. And Canute intended to seize it all. He ruled not just as a king of one land, but as a strategist shaping a northern empire. Every decision, every pause, every movement was deliberate, calculated, and aimed at dominance. To Canute, England was never a solitary kingdom. It was a hub in a wider world, bound together by trade, conflict, and family ties stretching from Scandinavia to the continent. Whoever commanded the North Sea controlled wealth, movement, and influence. This was not empire in the Roman sense. It was a network, fluid, interconnected, and alive. Canute understood that true dominance came not from endless conquest, but from mastering relationships. Ports mattered more than borders. Alliances mattered more than armies. Loyalty mattered more than land itself. His power extended outward not through constant battle, but through calculated pressure, strategic marriages, and a reputation that preceded him across coasts and kingdoms. England became the anchor of this system, prosperous, organized, and predictably stable. It was no longer just a land to hold, it was a base from which influence radiated. And predictability, as Canute knew well, attracts ambition. Allies, rivals, and opportunists all recognized the advantage of alignment, making England the center of a northern world in which Canute's vision was quietly, inexorably expanding. In 1018, Canute returned to Denmark not as a challenger but as king. The transition was far from simple. Danish politics were brutal, shaped by rival claims, shifting loyalties, and the constant expectation that a king remain ever present. A ruler abroad risked being forgotten, or worse, overthrown. Canute addressed the challenge the way he always did, decisively. Where force was necessary, he used it without hesitation. Where negotiation could achieve stability, he applied it shrewdly. Everywhere else, he imposed an unambiguous clarity that left no room for doubt. Rivals vanished, resistance crumbled, and authority was consolidated swiftly and efficiently. In a remarkable feat, Canute now ruled England and Denmark at the same time. 2 crowns, 1 commanding presence. It was an achievement that few in Europe could match, a demonstration of vision, strategy, and unrelenting will. But such success did not come without cost. The burdens of dual kingship, the constant vigilance, and the weight of 2 nations' expectations rested squarely on his shoulders. Power had expanded, but the demands of holding it were relentless, reminding all who witnessed that authority is never without sacrifice. Every mile Canute traveled away from England introduced a quiet uncertainty. Local rulers acted in his name, but never with his judgment. Decisions slowed. Minor disputes lingered unresolved. Authority persisted, but it no longer corrected itself with the immediacy that had defined his presence. Nothing immediately failed, and that was precisely the danger. When a system depends entirely on a single mind, collapse does not announce itself with warning. It waits, patient and hidden, beneath the calm surface. England appeared stable. Trade flowed, courts functioned. The machinery of governance continued, almost seamlessly. Yet beneath that apparent order, reliance on Canute deepened. Every choice, every settlement, every enforcement of law bore his imprint. Without him, the mechanisms of control could falter. In that moment, it became clear Canute was not merely king, he was the system itself. England's stability existed because of him, and only because of him. His presence alone held the delicate balance, reminding all that true authority is as much about vigilance as it is about command. Norway would challenge Canute in ways England never had. It was not wealthy, it was not centralized. Its people did not bend easily to foreign authority. Power there rested on personal loyalty, not written law, and allegiance could not be commanded from afar. Canute tried to rule remotely, appointing deputies and issuing decrees, expecting obedience. It failed. Resistance grew quietly, almost invisibly, fueled by resentment and the king's absence. Norwegian elites did not rise in open rebellion, they simply stopped cooperating. Administration slowed, enforcement weakened, authority seeped away imperceptibly until the system began to unravel. Canute responded with force, but force without presence is crude and often ineffective. It could punish, but it could not inspire compliance. Norway never truly accepted him, and through this struggle, Canute confronted an uncomfortable truth. Not every kingdom can be governed the same way. The strategies that had secured England, precision, patience, and carefully balanced authority, could not simply be transplanted elsewhere. Each land demanded its own approach, and mastery over one realm did not guarantee mastery over another. For the first time, Canute realized that the limits of power are defined not just by ambition, but by the very nature of the people it seeks to govern. At the peak of his power, Canute ruled more land than any English king before him, yet his control was not uniform. England flourished because its institutions were already established. Denmark obeyed because strength was respected. Norway resisted because loyalty could not be commanded, and trust had to be earned. Canute adapted to each realm, calibrating force, diplomacy, and presence to fit the needs of every kingdom. But adaptation has limits. An empire that relies on the vigilance of a single ruler eventually demands more than one man can provide. Attention is finite, and authority, no matter how absolute, can stretch only so far. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, cracks began to appear. There was no sudden rebellion, no spectacular failure, no dramatic collapse. The fractures were subtle, small delays, quiet disobedience, loyalties that wavered just slightly. They were invisible to most, yet unmistakably real. Even a king as capable as Canute could not fully bind the disparate strands of his dominion. The larger the empire, the more fragile the illusion of complete control. Canute understood that true power relied as much on symbolism as on strength. He funded churches, supported monasteries, and presented himself as a Christian ruler, humble before God, generous to the faithful, and mindful of divine order. This was not empty performance, it was deliberate strategy. Religion provided legitimacy that conquest alone could never grant. It transformed raw authority into duty, obedience into moral obligation. For the people of England, weary of chaos and foreign rule, this was profound. Through this lens, Canute was no longer simply a Viking overlord tolerated for the sake of stability. He was a king sanctioned by higher authority, a ruler whose reign carried the weight of providence itself. At least, that was the story he projected. It was a narrative carefully constructed, blending piety with power, faith with enforcement. One that shaped perception as effectively as armies had shaped borders. In England, the message was clear. Disobedience was not just politically unwise, it was spiritually fraught. And in this way, Canute wielded both belief and fear, intertwining them into a tool as potent as any sword. Centuries later, Canute would be remembered for a single story. A king who commanded the tide to halt and watched as the waves ignored him. The tale is often misunderstood. Canute never believed he could control the sea. The act was carefully staged, a lesson for his court. Even kings have limits, and no earthly authority can bend nature to its will. It was humility performed as theater, and in that moment, something crucial became clear. Canute understood that power, no matter how formidable, is never absolute. Rule is fragile, dependent on perception, loyalty, and circumstance. Authority can be decisive, but it is never permanent. That awareness made him remarkable. It shaped his decisions, his strategy, and his patience. He built systems, balanced fear with order, and wielded influence with precision. Yet wisdom alone cannot make an empire immortal. Canute could stabilize kingdoms, enforce obedience, and extend his reach across seas, but he could not guarantee that the structures he built would endure beyond his presence. Even the greatest rulers faced the unyielding truth. Time, absence, and human nature eventually test the limits of all authority. Canute ruled with brilliance and precision. He commanded loyalty, stabilized kingdoms, and projected authority that few could challenge. Yet there was one problem he never fully resolved: succession. His sons were not a united line of heirs. They were rivals, divided by competing claims, different mothers, distant lands, and personal ambition. There was no clear mechanism to transfer power seamlessly, no system to ensure that his authority could continue without conflict. Canute chose to postpone the problem. He focused on consolidating his reign, extending influence, and maintaining order, leaving the question of inheritance for the future. But postponed problems do not vanish. They do not fade quietly into history. They wait. And when the moment comes, when the ruler is gone and authority is no longer absolute, those unresolved issues erupt with a force that can undo decades of careful governance. For all his genius, Canute could not control what came after. The empire he built, the peace he enforced, and the fear he balanced depended on his presence. Succession, however, does not wait. By the late 1020s, Canute had reached the peak of his power. England was calm. Denmark was secure. His influence radiated across the North Sea, touching kingdoms, ports, and courts with a subtle authority few could challenge. From the outside, it seemed unshakable, a reign that could endure for generations. But the appearance of permanence was just that, appearance. Beneath the surface, the kingdom's stability rested entirely on Canute's judgment, his vigilance, and his restraint. Every law, every alliance, every settlement relied on his presence and decisiveness. These were qualities that could not be passed down. They could not be inherited. Authority flowed from a man, not a system. Canute had mastered rule itself. He commanded obedience, balanced fear with order, and maintained harmony across lands that had known chaos for decades. But he had not mastered continuity. He had not solved the question of what would happen when his hand was removed from the balance. And history, patient and unrelenting, would soon collect its debt, testing whether the empire he had built could survive beyond the presence of the king who had made it possible. After years of relentless motion, Canute's world began to slow. There were no sudden defeats, no rebellions blazing across the countryside, no messengers bringing news of dramatic reversals. Instead, something subtler, almost invisible, took hold. Expansion ceased, borders held, trade persisted. The empire continued to function, but it no longer grew. Canute spent more time managing than conquering, correcting than commanding, maintaining what already existed instead of shaping new lands. This was not failure, it was fatigue. Ruling three kingdoms demanded constant vigilance. Every decision mattered. Every absence created room for uncertainty. Canute had constructed a system that relied on him in every corner, and slowly, that became an impossible expectation. The machinery of his empire still operated. Courts held, armies were disciplined, taxes flowed. Yet it demanded more than any one man could sustain indefinitely. The empire was stable, but stability alone could not replace presence. Power had limits, even for a king as formidable as Canute. And in that quiet, Canute faced the unspoken truth of every ruler. Empires endure not because of brilliance alone, but because someone is there to keep them alive. In England, Canute's authority still appeared formidable, yet it was no longer reinforced by his constant presence. Local officials administered in his name, but they lacked his instinct, his judgment, his decisiveness. They relied on precedent rather than insight, and while this maintained order on the surface, it could not replicate the strength of his hand. Minor disputes lingered unresolved. Small injustices quietly accumulated. Nothing large enough to spark rebellion, but just enough to slowly corrode confidence. This is how systems erode, not with fanfare or drama, but quietly, imperceptibly, beneath the calm exterior. England had not regained resilience. It had learned dependence, and dependence is stable only as long as the center remains unshaken. Remove the guiding presence, and cracks widen. Authority becomes fragile. Systems that once seemed secure begin to wobble. Canute had built a kingdom that obeyed him, but not a kingdom capable of enduring without him. And in that quiet, subtle fragility, the true limitation of even the greatest rule became apparent. Stability without autonomy is always temporary. Canute was not blind to the limits of his power. He felt them keenly. Contemporary sources describe a king increasingly aware of time, of mortality, of the legacy he would leave, and of the arrangements left unfinished. His acts of generosity toward churches grew. His public displays of humility became more pronounced. This was not regret, it was preparation. Canute understood a truth his sons would never fully grasp. Power must be released deliberately, or it will shatter everything around it. Authority, when handed down too abruptly or without care, can unravel decades of order in a single generation. Yet knowing the danger did not provide a clear solution. He delayed decisive actions, avoided publicly naming an heir, and sought to balance rival claims rather than resolve them. For a time, this fragile equilibrium held. But balance is not the same as resolution. It postpones conflict but does not prevent it. It maintains the illusion of stability, while beneath the surface, unresolved tensions gather strength. Canute had mastered rule. He had not mastered succession, and the consequences of that oversight would echo long after his presence was gone. Canute's greatest vulnerability did not emerge from external enemies. It came from within, from his own children. Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut embodied competing futures, divided loyalties, and distinct visions of power. One was rooted in England, the other bound to Scandinavia. Each commanded supporters, each carried claims to legitimacy, and each expected to inherit authority. Canute refused to choose between them. Perhaps he believed that experience and the natural course of events would resolve the succession. Perhaps he trusted that his presence and reputation could restrain rivalry, even in absence. He was wrong. Authority that relies on a single, present hand cannot contain competition once that hand is gone. What is stable under constant oversight can fracture instantly without it. Canute's brilliance had built kingdoms and imposed order across seas. But the delicate balance of succession, the passing of power from one generation to the next, remained beyond his mastery. And in that unchosen moment, the seeds of instability were sown, ensuring that the empire he had so carefully maintained would face its greatest tests not from conquest, but from family. To the people of England, everything appeared normal. Markets bustled with trade, roads were safe, courts dispensed justice. Canute's name still commanded respect and obedience, but this was the kingdom's most perilous moment. Because stability had become an expectation, generations who had lived through chaos no longer remembered the delicate balance that held order in place. Peace was taken for granted. Continuity was assumed, and with that assumption came complacency. The lessons of uncertainty, of fragile alliances and fleeting loyalty, faded from memory, and when peace is assumed, preparation vanishes. Guard posts become less vigilant, nobles delay decisions, defenses grow lax. Authority, once reinforced by presence and active oversight, begins to erode quietly, invisibly. The machinery of governance continues, but it no longer hums with the same energy or precision. England seemed secure. It felt predictable. Yet beneath the surface, the kingdom relied entirely on memory, habit, and the echo of a king who would not always be there. Complacency is silent, it is invisible, and it is, in many ways, far more dangerous than any open rebellion. As Canute split his attention between kingdoms, his influence began to thin. Where once his presence shaped every decision, now messages carried his intent. Where once his judgment guided action, now orders were executed like routine tasks. Authority became administrative rather than personal. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it was irreversible. Power had shifted from living force to procedure. The machinery of rule continued to operate, but it lacked the vitality that had once made obedience certain and loyalty unshakable. Decisions were followed but not understood. Compliance existed, but conviction did not. And in moments of real crisis, procedure cannot replace leadership. The systems Canute had built depended on him, and without his constant presence, cracks began to widen. Minor delays could grow into serious vulnerabilities. Local officials could interpret orders differently. Allegiances, once secure through personal authority, became negotiable. The kingdom appeared stable, but the foundation had changed. And the very tools that had maintained peace under Canute's hand would not suffice when his authority was absent. revealing a truth all great rulers eventually confront. Procedure can maintain order, but only leadership can preserve a realm. In his later years, Canute leaned more deliberately into faith. He granted land, funded churches, and presented himself not just as a king of men, but as a ruler accountable to God. His devotion was genuine, yet it also carried purpose. Canute understood a profound truth: kingdoms endure beyond the lives of kings only when belief replaces fear. Authority rooted solely in intimidation or presence cannot survive absence. Faith, loyalty, and legitimacy must take their place. He sought to anchor his rule in something eternal, to make obedience a matter of conviction rather than coercion. Through religion, ritual, and visible piety, he aimed to transform fleeting authority into lasting stability. But institutions take time to grow. They cannot be constructed overnight, and Canute's clock was running down. Every passing year brought him closer to the moment when absence would test the durability of all he had built. The balance between fear, faith, and administration was delicate. Canute knew it. He acted with purpose, yet the limitations of time and mortality remained immutable. Even the wisest and most capable rulers confront a hard reality: a kingdom's endurance is never guaranteed, no matter the strength of its king. Without a clear plan for succession, Canute's authority began to lose its pull. Regional leaders grew bolder. Local power consolidated quietly, almost imperceptibly. Allegiance became conditional once more, dependent on circumstance rather than unwavering loyalty. Nothing fell apart abruptly. There were no dramatic uprisings, no sudden revolts. The kingdom functioned. Trade continued. Courts operated. The machinery of governance moved on. Yet the center no longer drew everything toward it. The invisible gravity of Canute's presence, the force that had held diverse lands, people, and ambitions together, began to weaken. Small fissures formed where authority had once flowed effortlessly. Decisions slowed, conflicts lingered, loyalties wavered. The cohesion that had defined his reign was quietly eroding. Empires depend on gravity. Not bricks or borders, but the centripetal force of command, respect, and presence. And when that force diminishes, no system, however well built, can prevent fragmentation. Canute had mastered control, but he could not master continuity. And in that slow drift, the seeds of the empire's eventual unraveling were already taking root. By the early 1030s, Canute's world seemed suspended in time. It was still strong, still orderly, still awe-inspiring, yet beneath the surface it was waiting. Those closest to power felt it first. Advisors, nobles, and officials watched with heightened attention, scrutinizing every word, every gesture. Decisions that had once flowed swiftly now slowed, as if anticipating guidance that might never come. Silence stretched between councils, between commands, between actions. England had become a kingdom trained to wait, to look toward the king for every signal, every instruction. Autonomy had withered under decades of centralized authority. Obedience had been internalized, but independence had not. And waiting is a dangerous thing when direction stops coming. The calm that once signaled mastery now hinted at fragility. Momentum, once provided by presence, had no substitute. Minor disputes could grow unchecked. Loyalties could shift quietly. Authority, though still respected, risked becoming ceremonial rather than practical. The kingdom appeared stable, but stability built on expectation is always fragile. And when the hand that guides the system is removed, even the strongest realm can unravel in ways no one anticipates. Canute had accomplished what few conquerors ever manage. He transformed conquest into continuity. England no longer felt occupied. It felt governed, orderly, almost inevitable. His rule normalized what had once been extraordinary, but normalization carries a hidden danger. It masks dependence. And dependence is fragile. It crumbles the moment the source of stability retreats. The king was aging. His health waned. His presence, once a constant, became intermittent. Every step he took away from daily oversight loosened the bonds that held the kingdom together. England moved with the rhythm of his attention. When that rhythm faltered, so too did the cohesion it enforced. Minor frictions, previously contained, began to whisper through the court and the shires. Loyalty, once unwavering, started to look negotiable again. The peace he had built still stood. Markets functioned, law endured, trade continued. But it was borrowed. Every calm day, every smooth transaction depended on the echo of his authority, not on enduring systems. And the moment that echo faded entirely, England would discover the cost of stability built on a single presence, a lesson all empires eventually learn, often too late. Canute did not fall in battle. There was no grand, dramatic ending to match the vastness of his reign. His decline came quietly, marked by illness, fatigue, and a gradual withdrawal from the decisions that had once defined his authority. Courts continued to meet, orders continued to circulate. On paper, everything appeared normal, but the presence that had given them weight, urgency, and clarity was slowly fading. This was not unusual. King's age, power shifts. But in Canute's case, the danger lay in how utterly the system had come to rely on him. He had been the final arbiter, the force that settled disputes, the authority that ended arguments before they could grow. His judgment had been the glue holding diverse lands and ambitions together. As that weight lifted, nothing moved quickly to replace it. The machinery of governance carried on, but the living force that had made obedience certain was gone. Silence began to spread outward from the center, subtle but relentless. And in that silence, the vulnerability of even the greatest empires became painfully clear. Order without presence is only temporary. In 1035, Canute died. There was no grand proclamation, no carefully staged succession, no smooth transfer of power. The king was simply gone, and with his absence vanished the delicate balance that had kept England, Denmark, and parts of Norway aligned under one hand. At first, the kingdom did not explode. There was no immediate revolt, no dramatic uprising. Instead, confusion took hold. Who now wielded real authority, whose orders carried weight, which councils could claim legitimacy. Every decision, every act of governance seemed uncertain. Canute had ruled with unmatched skill, commanding obedience, balancing fear with order, and maintaining peace across diverse lands. He had mastered the art of authority. But brilliance alone could not guarantee longevity. He had created a system that depended entirely on his presence, on his judgment, on his ability to enforce equilibrium. Without him, the carefully maintained calm began to fray. England had known stability. England had known obedience, but it had never known independence. And in that moment, the kingdom faced a harsh truth. Canute had ruled brilliantly, but he had not ruled sustainably. The next generation would pay the price for that absence. Harold Harefoot moved first. He was present, familiar, and in moments of uncertainty, proximity often outweighs formal legitimacy. Authority is as much about being there as it is about right. Harthacnut, the son Canute had intended as heir, was absent, held in Denmark by unrest, obligations, and distant responsibilities. England could not pause for theory or expectation. It rarely does. Harold stepped into the void. He did not claim the throne with a grand proclamation or elaborate ceremony. Instead, he was accepted by default. Officials obeyed. Nobles adjusted their allegiances. Daily life continued, uninterrupted by questions of principle. This was not loyalty, it was pragmatism. The kingdom, conditioned by years of central authority and dependence on Canute's presence, bent to what was practical, not what was rightful. Decisions were made quickly, alignments shifted quietly, and authority consolidated around the one who was already there. Harold's ascent was neither heroic nor contested, it was inevitable, and in that inevitability lies a lesson. When systems rely on presence over principle, power becomes something transient, claimed by whoever occupies the space first. Harold was not Canute. He lacked the authority, the measured restraint, and the far-reaching influence that had defined his father's reign. His rule was reactive rather than proactive, cautious rather than decisive, and increasingly uncertain as time passed. The calm that had once defined England did not shatter. It thinned, stretched, and frayed at the edges. The machinery of governance continued, but the consistency that had inspired obedience was gone. Justice became uneven, unpredictable, and regionally varied. Local officials exercised authority according to convenience rather than mandate. Decisions that had once flowed smoothly from a central hand now shifted from county to county, creating pockets of confusion and quiet tension. The people and nobles felt it immediately. England had known order. Now it encountered inconsistency. It was not chaos in the dramatic sense. There were no revolts, no open wars, but the subtle decay was more dangerous than any battle. This was not collapse, it was regression. A kingdom that had learned to rely on presence now faced the slow erosion of authority, proving that stability rooted in a single ruler is never permanent. Across the North Sea, Harthacnut prepared his return. He was Canute's chosen heir, legitimate by arrangement and acknowledged in reputation. Yet legitimacy alone carries little weight without presence. Authority, like a flame, requires tending. Distance allows it to flicker and fade. By the time Harthacnut was ready to step into England, the kingdom had already adjusted to Harold's rule. Officials, nobles, and communities had grown accustomed to the patterns of governance established in his absence. The rhythm of daily life, once shaped by Canute, had shifted. Changing rulers again now carried risk, uncertainty, and hesitation. England, conditioned to follow the hand that was present, paused. The kingdom measured the cost of transition against the potential benefits. Every action, every decision, became a question of timing and consequence. So England hesitated. Once more, it deferred to practicality over principle. Once more, it demonstrated that kingdoms are as much about perception and continuity as they are about legitimacy. The stage was set, the air waited, and beneath the surface, the fragile balance of authority, so carefully maintained by Canute, teetered quietly, awaiting the next decisive act that could reshape the realm. Without Canute, England began to drift backward. The structures he had enforced remained, but their strength depended entirely on his presence. Old rivalries, long held in check, began to resurface quietly. Local leaders tested boundaries. Decisions that once flowed seamlessly from the center now stalled, deferred, or bent to convenience. Authority no longer corrected itself automatically. It required intervention, judgment, and the personal weight of a king who was no longer there. The peace Canute had built was still visible, still functional. Markets operated, courts convened, and laws were enforced, but it no longer had momentum of its own. Stability had been borrowed from a man, not embedded in a system. The center, the magnetic force that had held England together, had vanished. Orders lacked urgency, compliance lacked conviction, allegiance became conditional, and nothing stepped forward to replace it. The kingdom remained intact, yet fragile. The calm was a veneer, masking an invisible decay. And in that decay lay the seeds of conflict, uncertainty, and quiet chaos, waiting for the right moment to reveal how dependent England had been on a single ruler. A lesson that would shape the realm for years to come. Canute had ruled through judgment, not through systems. That was the source of his genius. Decisions were swift, precise, and authoritative. He balanced fear with order, presence with prudence. The kingdom responded not because of laws alone, but because of the weight of his hand and the clarity of his will. But that same approach was also his weakness. Authority built around a single mind cannot endure its absence. Procedures, traditions, and offices cannot replicate the insight, timing, or decisiveness of a ruler like Canute. When his judgment disappeared, there was nothing to sustain it. The structures he had left behind could manage routine, but they could not enforce cohesion, loyalty, or confidence. England did not merely lose a king. It lost the stabilizing force that had held together decades of potential chaos. The magnetic center of the realm, which had aligned nobles, officials, and communities, simply vanished. And in that absence, the illusion of calm began to crumble. For a kingdom that had grown dependent on presence, the loss of Canute was more than the passing of a ruler. It was the disappearance of the very anchor that had made England whole. Harold Harefoot's reign was brief, a pause in England's turbulent story. When he died in 1040, Harthacnut finally crossed the North Sea to claim the throne his father had intended for him. He arrived not to a kingdom brimming with confidence, but to one already worn thin by years of uncertainty, divided loyalties, and quiet disappointment. The calm that Canute had enforced had eroded into hesitation. Officials waited. Nobles watched. The people, long accustomed to strong presence, had begun to forget what steady leadership felt like. Harthacnut ruled with a different hand. His approach was harsh, punitive, and uncompromising, shaped as much by resentment as by necessity. Fear became his tool, wielded to assert authority where respect had not yet taken root. The stability that had defined Canute's era, the careful balance of obedience, loyalty, and predictable justice, was gone. In its place came vigilance, tension, and an awareness that the kingdom's cohesion was fragile, dependent on enforcement rather than trust. England survived, but it had changed. It was no longer the kingdom that had bent quietly under Canute's steady hand. It was a realm reminded, painfully, that even great achievements can be fleeting. Harthacnut attempted to reclaim authority with force. He wielded punishment decisively, expecting fear to restore order. But force alone, divorced from legitimacy and trust, achieves little more than resentment. England had once known stability under Canute. The people and nobles had seen what governance could feel like when guided by presence and judgment. Now, that experience stood in sharp contrast to harsh reprisals. Punishment felt less like enforcement and more like betrayal. Rebellion did not break out immediately. There were no open wars at first. The danger was subtler, quieter, and more insidious. England began to disengage. Officials followed orders mechanically. Nobles complied strategically. The population obeyed, but without conviction. Daily life continued, yet loyalty and initiative shrank. Disengagement is fatal to rule. Authority survives on active participation, belief, and alignment of interests. When those things vanish, even the most formidable armies and the strictest laws cannot maintain control. Harthacnut's struggle revealed a simple truth. Power enforced through fear may command outward compliance, but it cannot recreate the cohesion, confidence, or legitimacy that once made a kingdom resilient. England remained, but the heart of its obedience had already begun to fade. Canute left England quieter than he had found it, but quiet is not the same as permanence. Peace enforced by presence is fragile. It thrives only while the hand that guides it remains steady. His reign proved something remarkable, that a kingdom fractured by fear, division, and indecision could be held together by competence. That conquest need not mean ruin. That authority, tempered by judgment and restraint, could produce order even in the midst of chaos. Yet it also revealed a darker truth. Stability built entirely on one man's vision and presence is fleeting. When that presence vanishes, so too does the illusion of continuity. England would soon learn this lesson over and over, as local rivalries, contested successions, and absent rulers slowly chipped away at the foundations Canute had so carefully laid. By 1066, a new conqueror would arrive, and England would once again confront the harsh reality that power is never permanent, no matter how brilliantly wielded. Canute the Great did not fail. He ruled wisely, decisively, and effectively. His achievements reshaped a kingdom. But even the greatest success, anchored in a single mind, is ultimately mortal, and in that mortality lies the enduring lesson of his remarkable reign. With Canute gone, England appeared calm. The streets were orderly, markets operated, taxes flowed, courts dispensed justice. On the surface, life continued as if nothing had changed. From afar, the kingdom seemed steady, even secure. But that normality was fragile, a thin veneer stretched over unresolved tensions. Canute's presence had been the invisible glue holding together fragile alliances, rival claims, and divided loyalties. Every oath, every arrangement, every agreement had relied on his authority to give it weight. Without him, these bonds became tentative, vulnerable to doubt and ambition. England had inherited order without its architect. The machinery of governance still turned, but it lacked the judgment, force, and clarity that had once directed it. Decisions were made, but without conviction. Obedience existed, but without trust. In such moments, patience can be as dangerous as rebellion. The kingdom's calm masked a quiet instability, waiting for the smallest spark to reveal how dependent it had been on one man's presence. The streets were quiet, life appeared steady. Yet beneath that surface, the weight of absence pressed down, a subtle, insidious reminder that authority anchored in a single mind is never truly permanent. Harold Harefoot, one of Canute's sons, found himself in the right place at exactly the right moment. His presence alone commanded England's attention. While Harthacnut remained across the North Sea in Denmark, Harold occupied the vacuum. Nobles and officials complied not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. Someone had to take charge, and for now, that someone was him. For a brief period, the kingdom adjusted. Decisions were made, disputes resolved, and daily life continued with a semblance of order. On the surface, England functioned, but beneath that calm lay a quiet fragility. Harold lacked the precision, foresight, and judgment that had defined Canute's reign. Where his father had balanced fear with fairness, authority with restraint, Harold ruled largely by instinct and convenience. Decisions were reactive, priorities inconsistent, and enforcement uneven. That distinction mattered. It shaped the culture of power, the behavior of nobles, and the expectations of the people. In the decade that followed, Harold's reign would demonstrate a simple truth. Presence can sustain obedience, but only foresight and discipline can create enduring stability. Harthacnut remained in Denmark, preoccupied with securing his Scandinavian throne. His absence proved costly. Slowly, England's people and nobility began to accept Harold, not as the rightful king by law or inheritance, but as the only ruler who was actually present. Authority, once anchored in legitimacy, shifted toward whoever could exert it in practice. Presence had become the measure of power. Harthacnut's claim remained strong on paper, yet it carried no weight across the North Sea. Harold, meanwhile, acted decisively, settled disputes, and enforced obedience. The kingdom adjusted, not because of loyalty or principle, but because someone needed to lead. Necessity overruled inheritance. Theory yielded to reality. This dynamic would leave a lasting imprint on England. For years, the perception of order would depend less on law, tradition, or right, and more on who could assert control first. Authority became practical, immediate, and fragile, tied to the body and presence of the ruler rather than the enduring strength of institutions. In this subtle shift, the kingdom learned a harsh lesson. The illusion of stability is often sustained by those who act, not those who are owed obedience. England, once held together under Canute's steady hand, began to fracture quietly. The changes were subtle at first. Regional leaders tested boundaries, making small adjustments in authority and influence. Local disputes simmered beneath the surface, resolved not by a decisive center, but by negotiation, convenience, or temporary compromise. Loyalties shifted imperceptibly, as nobles and officials adapted to the absence of the king who had once unified them. Daily life appeared unchanged. Markets functioned. Courts convened. Taxes were collected. The kingdom remained functional, giving the illusion that stability endured. But the coherence Canute had enforced was gone. The magnetic center of authority he had embodied no longer held the threads of power tightly together. Fragmentation moved silently, unnoticed by most, yet inexorably reshaping the kingdom's political landscape. Over time, these small cracks would widen. What had once been a realm bound by presence and judgment began to operate through expediency and inertia. The legacy of Canute's rule remained, but its foundation, the careful balance of authority, loyalty, and oversight, had begun to dissolve, leaving England poised for new conflicts and uncertain futures. Even as political instability took hold, the echoes of Canute's reforms endured in quiet, almost invisible ways. Markets continued to operate under familiar rules. Coinage remained consistent, facilitating trade and commerce. Legal codes persisted, shaping judgments and disputes long after the king who had enforced them was gone. For ordinary people, these structures provided a sense of continuity, a thread of order woven through the uncertainty of succession and fragmented authority. England, in many ways, still benefited from 2 decades of disciplined administration. Decisions once centralized under Canute's judgment left a lingering framework that could guide governance, even as individual rulers faltered. These remnants of order were a lifeline, sustaining daily life and commerce, preventing complete collapse. Yet the lesson was unavoidable. Even the most enduring structures cannot substitute for the presence of a competent ruler. Partial stability can outlast a king, but it cannot replicate the authority, judgment, and cohesion that only he could provide. Without Canute, the kingdom functioned, but it lacked the decisive force that had made it truly whole. In this tension between structure and absence, England faced the reality that continuity is fragile, even when history leaves visible traces. Canute had ruled in part through fear, deliberate, measured, and purposeful. It was not cruelty for its own sake, but a tool to maintain order, to ensure that authority was respected and that challenges were calculated carefully. His presence reinforced it, giving structure to both obedience and restraint. His successors, however, could not replicate that delicate balance. Some attempted to wield force with the same precision, others hesitated, uncertain how far authority could stretch. As memory of Canute's judgment faded, old insecurities began to resurface. Nobles quietly tested limits, probing for weakness. Minor rebellions flickered into existence, tolerated or ignored until they could grow. The people, long accustomed to Canute's strict yet steady hand, began to sense that power was no longer absolute. Authority could be negotiated, manipulated, or lost entirely. The calm that Canute had imposed, carefully cultivated over decades, unraveled silently. England still functioned, still obeyed, but the invisible web of presence and control that had held the kingdom together was gone. What remained was fragile, contingent, and increasingly uncertain. For a fleeting moment, England seemed united under Harold Harefoot. The appearance of stability was carefully maintained through pragmatism rather than loyalty. Officials followed instructions, nobles negotiated behind closed doors, taxes were collected, markets operated, and roads were patrolled. On the surface, life continued as if nothing had changed. Yet beneath that veneer, the kingdom's deeper structure, the intertwined networks of loyalty, judgment, and authority had eroded. Decisions were made, but without vision. Obedience existed, but without conviction. Where Canute had ruled with presence, precision, and foresight, Harold relied on circumstance and convenience. This fragile equilibrium masked the truth. England's stability was provisional, dependent on habit rather than governance. The structures Canute had enforced persisted, but their effectiveness waned without the force of his judgment behind them. And as history has shown again and again, cracks hidden beneath calm widen fastest when the center is weakest. Authority without strength, obedience without trust, and order without vision cannot endure indefinitely. England's surface calm would hold for now, but the silent erosion of power had begun, setting the stage for the next wave of uncertainty, rivalry, and the eventual reckoning that decades of careful rule could not prevent. In 1040, Harthacnut finally crossed the North Sea from Denmark. He did not arrive to open arms or unquestioned allegiance. England had grown accustomed to Harold Harefoot's practical authority, and the kingdom had adjusted to a ruler who was present, if imperfect. Change would not come easily. Harthacnut carried a reputation that preceded him, harsh, decisive, and unpredictable. Nobles who had grown comfortable under Harold's tempered rule now faced a renewed tension, the subtle, controlled fear that Canute had once wielded with uncanny precision. Authority was no longer a gentle force. It was a presence that demanded attention, compliance, and caution. This arrival marked more than a simple succession. It was a turning point, a stark reminder that stability in England was never inherited, never guaranteed. It depended entirely on the ruler who stood at the center, the hand that enforced order, and the presence that commanded respect. For the people and the elite alike, the lesson was unmistakable. Legitimacy alone could not sustain a kingdom. Presence, decisiveness, and the exercise of authority were what preserved calm, and without them, even the most enduring legacy could unravel in quiet, dangerous ways. Harthacnut moved with speed and precision. Rivals were removed, sometimes violently. Authority was reasserted in key regions where hesitation had taken root. Disloyalty was punished swiftly, sending a clear signal. The crown's power was present, decisive, and not to be tested. Order returned to England, but it was harsher, more uneven, and lacking the careful equilibrium Canute had once maintained. The kingdom experienced control again, but at a cost. Fear and resentment quietly accompanied obedience. Nobles complied not with trust or conviction, but from caution and calculation. The streets remained calm, the courts operated, and taxes flowed, yet beneath this surface, tension simmered. Once more, the lessons of Canute's reign became visible. Competence can stabilize a fractured kingdom, even after years of uncertainty, but authority grounded in a single ruler's presence cannot be passed down automatically. The structures left behind may support daily life, but they cannot replicate the judgment, foresight, and balance of the king who built them. England had learned this truth repeatedly. Lasting stability demands more than systems or traditions. It demands a capable, present, and decisive hand, and such hands are never easily replaced. Canute's empire had stretched as far as one man's vision could reach. The moment he was gone, the fragile scaffolding of his rule began to show. England remained functional, but it was now a kingdom held together by habit rather than judgment. Denmark was under control, yet Norway resisted quietly, asserting its independence in subtle ways. Succession disputes resurfaced. Nobles tested boundaries, seeking advantage in the absence of decisive oversight. Ordinary people adapted to whoever was present, measuring loyalty by proximity rather than principle. Canute's brilliance had been in centralizing authority, in making presence, judgment, and foresight the true pillars of power. That same genius, however, revealed its vulnerability once he was gone. Systems dependent on one mind can survive only as long as that mind remains engaged. Stability, when wielded with such skill, can feel cinematic, awe-inspiring, even magical. But its permanence is an illusion. Without the hand that created it, order can fracture, predictably and quietly, leaving only the memory of what once held a kingdom together. England would live with that dependence for decades, relearning again and again the costs of relying on a ruler rather than resilient institutions. After Harthacnut reasserted authority, England felt calm again. Markets ran, roads were patrolled, taxes collected. It seemed as though Canute's achievements endured, but the calm was different. It lacked the subtle tension Canute had managed so well, the balance between fear, fairness, and loyalty. Decisions were slower. Nobles tested boundaries quietly. Minor rebellions surfaced, extinguished by force rather than consensus. The system functioned, but it was fragile, like a bridge built on shifting sand. Canute's absence revealed the truth. He had ruled through presence, not institutions. England had inherited structure, but not resilience. Canute's reforms left England wealthier and more organized than it had been under any previous king. Roads, trade routes, and markets functioned efficiently. Coins bore his name, his laws lingered. Institutions had a faint imprint of permanence, yet legacy is a double-edged sword. By raising expectations, Canute made his successor's shortcomings more apparent. Every failure, hesitation, or absence felt amplified against the backdrop of his competence. The kingdom remembered what it once had, and it demanded the impossible. While England attempted to maintain order, Canute's other realms reminded everyone of the limits of his empire. Denmark had been secured, but local nobles remained watchful. Norway resisted, loyal to its own traditions and leadership. Canute's system depended on him personally mediating conflicts, but now, with his sons and deputies in charge, gaps emerged. Without Canute, coordination failed, trade slowed, authority became uneven, borders were controlled, but allegiance was conditional. The empire's apparent stability was a mirage, functional only when every part accepted the center's authority. Harthacnut and Harold Harefoot had inherited more than crowns. They inherited responsibility for kingdoms built on presence, not systems. Harthacnut's delayed arrival in England meant Harold filled the void. Once Harthacnut returned, rivalries intensified. Nobles and earls aligned with whichever son could assert control most immediately. England, once unified under Canute, now faced division, quiet, bureaucratic, but deeply destabilizing. The subtle tension Canute had managed through foresight now manifested in uncertainty, fear, and selective loyalty. Leadership had shifted from strategic vision to reactive authority. Canute had ruled partly through fear, structured, deliberate, predictable fear that supported law and order. But fear without clarity collapses quickly. Under Harthacnut and Harold, fear existed, but it was inconsistent. Some nobles were punished, others ignored. Predictability vanished. People learned to hedge bets, wait for outcomes, and choose sides carefully. Power became transactional, not absolute. England had seen competence. Now it understood fragility. One of Canute's lasting tools was the church. Monasteries flourished. Clergy gained authority alongside kings. Faith became a stabilizing force, offering continuity beyond mortal rulers. Harthacnut maintained church relationships aggressively, ensuring loyalty from religious leaders. But the church alone could not sustain civil obedience. It could legitimize authority, but it could not enforce unity where political skill and judgment were absent. England remained outwardly faithful, but internal cohesion was fragile. Structures existed, but cohesion depended on humans who now lacked Canute's decisiveness. To ordinary people, England seemed strong. Markets thrived. Roads were patrolled. Law appeared impartial. Successors of Canute gave the impression of stability, but illusion is dangerous, because when the center eventually falters, ordinary people, accustomed to order, are unprepared for rapid chaos. Systems built around one man's authority are brittle. Canute had ruled a fragile peace, and that fragility persisted long after him. Canute's North Sea network remained active. Trade routes linked England, Denmark, and parts of Norway. Merchants benefited, cities prospered, cultural exchange continued, yet even here absence mattered. Canute had mediated disputes, coordinated trade, and ensured loyalty across kingdoms. Now small disruptions emerged, slow payments, local conflicts, delayed shipments. The network functioned, but efficiency eroded. The kingdom's outward prosperity masked internal instability. A bustling market could hide fractured allegiances. Canute had known this, his successors did not. England under Harthacnut and Harold had survived Canute's absence, but only barely. The systems he built, the fear he imposed, the subtle judgments he applied, all were gone. His successors ruled, but they ruled differently. The illusion of competence remained, yet the substance had eroded. The next generation of kings would inherit wealth, law, and territory, but they would not inherit the man who had made it coherent. And history has always been unkind to kingdoms that confuse illusion for reality. Canute's reign demonstrates a rare truth. Leadership is as much about presence as policy. One man's judgment held together multiple kingdoms, a network of loyalties, and a fragile peace. Competence, decisiveness, and foresight can stabilize chaos, but only temporarily, unless embedded in institutions that survive absence. By the time Harthacnut and Harold ruled fully, the lesson was clear. England had gained order, but it had not gained resilience. The foundation was personal, not structural. Canute's story is a reminder that brilliance can be transient, success can be undeniable, yet impermanent. And stability built on a single individual is always borrowed, never owned. His empire was a triumph, but it was also a warning. With Canute gone, his empire became an organism without a heart. England functioned, Denmark maintained order, Norway resisted quietly, but the connections that held them together began to falter. Trade continued, nobles complied, laws were enforced, life appeared normal. But beneath the surface, dependencies stretched thin. Local rulers made decisions for themselves. Disputes that could once have been quelled by a single, decisive judgment lingered. Small fractures multiplied. England was stable in appearance, but brittle in reality. Canute had been both architect and engineer of a delicate balance. Without him, the structure remained, but the scaffolding was gone. Harthacnut's arrival in England brought immediate change. Unlike his father, he ruled through fear alone, abrupt, uncompromising, unpredictable. Nobles who had grown comfortable under Harold or during Canute's absence were punished swiftly. Compliance became survival, yet fear cannot replace judgment. England became outwardly obedient, but internal cohesion weakened. Regional leaders acted cautiously, making decisions that protected their own power rather than serving the kingdom. Canute's subtle genius, balancing force with fairness, could not be replicated. Authority existed, but only in appearance. Ordinary people sensed the change too. Life continued, but trust shifted. Decisions by local leaders replaced guidance from a strong king. Markets operated, but disputes lingered. Laws were enforced, but selectively. England had grown accustomed to structure. Now it was learning to navigate ambiguity. Canute's era had been a masterclass in visible yet subtle authority. Harthacnut's rule was simply visible, stark, demanding, and unpredictable. England survived, but it was no longer unified in spirit. Compliance was transactional, not loyal. Even decades later, historians note the consequences. Canute had created stability through personal authority, but he had not institutionalized succession. His sons inherited crowns, but not the systems that made them effective. Rivalries emerged quietly, loyalties divided, and governance became reactive instead of anticipatory. The kingdom had become a study in the limits of borrowed stability. England was orderly, but brittle. The lessons of Canute's reign lingered. Brilliance can maintain empires, but personal authority cannot be inherited automatically. Without careful preparation, success becomes a temporary illusion. Canute's vision extended beyond conquest. He fostered trade and cultural exchange. England, Denmark, and parts of Norway were connected through commerce, navigation, and diplomacy. Merchants traveled freely, markets flourished, monasteries acted as centers of learning and governance. Even after his death, these networks persisted, though more fragile. ships crossed the North Sea, goods circulated, and cities remained prosperous. The outward prosperity masked internal fractures, a reminder that structures built on a single ruler could sustain function without coherence, but not indefinitely. Religion was another pillar of Canute's rule. He patronized churches and monasteries, aligning himself with the Christian faith. This legitimized his authority, and after his death, the church helped maintain order in England. Clergy mediated disputes, recorded laws, and influenced nobles, yet the church could not replace judgment. Its authority stabilized the kingdom superficially, but personal loyalty and governance skills remained vital. Canute's successors relied on faith, but their rule lacked his balance, subtlety, and strategic patience. The kingdom survived, but it no longer thrived as a cohesive entity. England under Canute's successors appeared peaceful, but appearances were deceptive. Minor rebellions flared quietly, disputes lingered, and nobles negotiated loyalties carefully. The fear Canute had balanced with justice had been replaced by uneven enforcement. Compliance remained, but cohesion was gone. This subtle instability would shape the kingdom for decades. England had learned to function without Canute, but the moment of his absence revealed the fragility of central authority built on personal skill rather than institutions. Beyond England, Canute's North Sea empire also shifted. Denmark maintained order under Harthacnut's attention, but Norway remained resistant, uncooperative, and loosely tied. The web Canute had woven, a network of authority, loyalty, and commerce, began to fray. The North Sea world functioned, but only because traders and nobles acted pragmatically. Authority had become transactional. Alliances persisted, but ambition simmered quietly. Canute had held the strands together personally. Without him, tension replaced cohesion, and fragility became the rule. By the 1040s, England seemed calm on the surface. Life continued, markets thrived, and trade flowed. Yet everywhere, observers sensed a subtle unease. Authority was no longer absolute. Nobles waited, leaders hedged bets. Ordinary people adapted quietly. Canute's genius had maintained cohesion through presence. Harthacnut and Harold ruled, but they ruled differently. The illusion of stability existed, but the foundation was weakened. England learned through subtle signs that empires built on individual brilliance are temporary. The story of Canute is a reminder. Stability can be brilliant, but impermanent. His reign showed how skill, decisiveness, and presence can hold kingdoms together. Yet, without succession planning and durable institutions, brilliance fades. By the end of the 1040s, England was functional, prosperous, and outwardly calm. But the seeds of future crises were planted. Divided loyalties, fragile authority, and an unprepared populace. In less than 2 decades, England would face new challenges that would test every lesson Canute had left behind. His empire was a triumph, but his absence revealed its fragility. Canute's story teaches a timeless truth. Personal brilliance can hold a kingdom together, but it cannot create permanence. History rewards systems, not individuals. And England, having learned this lesson quietly under Canute's successors, would soon face the consequences. By the mid-1040s, England had learned a quiet lesson. Authority is fragile when it depends on a single individual. Canute had ruled with precision, balancing fear, law, and presence. His successors lacked his subtlety, and the cracks became more visible. Minor disputes, previously quelled with a single judgment, lingered. Local lords exercised influence unchecked. Nobles whispered, tested limits, and hedged loyalties. Ordinary people obeyed, but obedience had become cautious, conditional, transactional. England's stability was now more a reflection of habit than governance. The illusion of order persisted, but the bonds that Canute had maintained personally were weakening. Power, once concentrated in one brilliant mind, was now dispersed, uneven, and vulnerable. Canute's reign left more than political structures, it left cultural connections. His support for the church, trade, and monastic scholarship created a web of influence that outlived him. Monks recorded laws, merchants traveled safely, and cities thrived economically. Yet culture alone could not enforce loyalty. The structures he helped cultivate remained vibrant but disconnected from central authority. England had inherited prosperity and literacy, but not the cohesion Canute's presence had ensured. His successors benefited from the legacy, yet struggled to wield it effectively. Across the North Sea, Canute's empire faced its own challenges. Denmark remained relatively stable under Harthacnut, yet Norway resisted fully accepting centralized authority. Regional lords maintained local autonomy, and trade routes became subject to negotiation rather than command. The North Sea network Canute had woven, commerce, diplomacy, and influence continued to function. Yet without his mediation, small disputes became protracted and coordination faltered. The empire had survived his death, but only because of inertia and pragmatism, not lasting cohesion. Harthacnut's absence from England during his early reign exemplified the dangers Canute had always managed so well. Authority depended on the ruler's presence. When Harthacnut was distant, local leaders made independent decisions. Loyalties shifted quietly. The kingdom remained orderly, but the delicate balance Canute had maintained was gone. England learned a stark lesson. Systems dependent on individuals are inherently brittle. Even when leaders act decisively, the absence of personal oversight allows small cracks to grow into fractures over time. Canute's genius had hidden these cracks, but once removed, they widened relentlessly. Canute had mastered the illusion of permanence. To contemporaries, England seemed steady, united, and prosperous. Trade flourished, laws were enforced, nobles complied, life went on, but beneath the surface, continuity was borrowed. Structures existed, but they depended on someone to guide them. Canute's successors had inherited function, not resilience. Authority persisted in practice, but not in spirit. The kingdom's outward stability hid vulnerability, and every decision now carried the weight of what had been lost. Beyond England, Canute's North Sea empire also showed strain. Denmark required constant oversight to remain orderly. Norway resisted obedience, maintaining local autonomy and negotiating loyalty through pragmatism rather than allegiance. Trade persisted, yet inefficiencies grew. Canute had held these realms together through presence, authority, and negotiation. Without him, cohesion relied on inertia, not intention. The network survived, but it was vulnerable to disruption, leaving the empire functional but fragile. Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut's succession disputes were quiet but deadly. Nobles chose sides, not for loyalty but for survival. Minor conflicts simmered beneath the surface. These small, unseen rivalries had long-term consequences, destabilizing regions subtly. England's people observed. Life continued, but uncertainty lingered. Canute had ruled through personal authority, combining presence with strategy. His successors ruled reactively. The empire survived, but the spirit of unity was gone. Authority was transactional, compliance cautious, and loyalty conditional. Despite the unraveling, Canute's governance left a lasting imprint. Law, trade, and religious structures endured. England was wealthier, more organized, and more connected to Scandinavia and continental Europe than ever before. Monasteries preserved knowledge, merchants sustained commerce, and cities thrived. Yet his legacy was paradoxical. Prosperity survived, but central authority weakened. England had inherited Canute's structures without inheriting his judgment, foresight, or presence. Function persisted, coherence did not. The subtle weaknesses of post-Canute England laid the groundwork for future crises. Authority depended on proximity and decisiveness, yet successors ruled from distance or through reactive measures. Nobles hedged their loyalty, minor rebellions simmered, and regional autonomy expanded quietly. Canute's brilliance had hidden these vulnerabilities. His successors could maintain order temporarily, but without the guiding presence that had once held the system together, the kingdom teetered on the edge of instability. England's future challenges, culminating in the Norman conquest 3 decades later, were seeded in these quiet years. Canute's story is a masterclass in the limits of personal power. He ruled 3 kingdoms with extraordinary skill, balancing authority, law, and fear. Yet his genius was personal, not institutional. When he died, his carefully constructed world continued to function, but only superficially. The lesson resonates centuries later. Brilliance can stabilize empires, but it cannot replace resilience. Systems must endure beyond a single ruler. England learned this slowly, quietly, and sometimes painfully. Canute's reign left wealth, order, and cultural connections, but it also left dependence, fragility, and vulnerability. Even as the kingdoms he ruled appeared calm, the seeds of future upheaval had already been sown. The subtle cracks that Canute had hidden with presence and judgment would later widen, reshaping England's destiny. His legacy is not just in conquest or peace. It is in the reminder that authority, when tied to a single mind, is both magnificent and fleeting. The genius of Canute the Great endures, not because it lasted forever, but because it shows us the delicate balance between personal brilliance and enduring institutions. By the 1050s, England remained outwardly stable, but the center of authority was weaker than ever. Canute's successors maintained law, trade, and religious networks, but they lacked the subtle authority their father had wielded. Decisions were slower, loyalties conditional, and the kingdom increasingly dependent on local leaders. Ordinary people continued their lives, oblivious to the cracks beneath the surface. Markets operated, roads were safe. Justice appeared fair, yet subtle signs of tension, whispers among nobles, delays in enforcing decrees, small regional disputes, revealed the precariousness of order without a unifying presence. England had learned an important, often painful lesson. A kingdom may survive the death of a brilliant ruler, but the stability that genius created will not endure without institutions to support it. Harthacnut ruled with an iron fist, enforcing obedience through fear. Unlike Canute, who balanced authority with justice and foresight, Harthacnut's reign was reactive and punitive. Nobles complied, but their loyalty was fragile, grounded in fear rather than trust or admiration. The kingdom functioned under his rule, yet the underlying cohesion had eroded. Where Canute had mediated disputes quietly and decisively, Harthacnut relied on brute authority. England was orderly but tense. Compliance persisted, but unity did not. This period demonstrates the danger of centralizing authority around one ruler. Absent skill, judgment, or foresight, force can maintain order temporarily, but cannot sustain long-term stability. Despite political tension, Canute's influence persisted culturally. Monasteries thrived, literacy spread, trade networks endured, and religious structures remained pillars of governance. England was wealthier, more organized, and more connected to Scandinavia and Europe than ever before. Yet cultural continuity masked political fragility. Trade continued, but disputes along routes increased. Monks recorded laws, but enforcement was inconsistent. Cities prospered, but their growth relied on local governance more than central authority. Canute's systems remained visible, but the subtle authority sustaining them had vanished. The kingdom had inherited his structures, not his presence. Prosperity endured, but cohesion was a fragile, borrowed legacy. Canute's empire stretched across England, Denmark, and parts of Norway, connected by trade, diplomacy, and shared authority. After his death, these connections persisted, but with weaker threads. Denmark remained relatively stable under Harthacnut. Norway resisted centralized authority, maintaining local autonomy. Trade continued, but coordination faltered. Small disputes and minor interruptions became routine. The empire's apparent stability was a mirage, functional but brittle. Canute's brilliance had woven cohesion across kingdoms. His successors could not replicate it. The network survived, but it was vulnerable. Without his presence, authority became transactional, and every region acted increasingly in its own interest. England's local lords had grown used to exercising power in the absence of a strong central ruler. Canute's death revealed that much of the authority he had centralized relied on his personal judgment and presence. As Harthacnut and Harold attempted to assert control, local leaders quietly reasserted autonomy where they could. These subtle shifts did not disrupt daily life immediately, but they weakened the structural integrity of the kingdom. What had once been a tightly controlled system became patchwork governance, held together by habit and fear rather than strategy. The illusion of Canute's enduring order persisted, yet the foundation beneath it was eroding. For ordinary citizens, England appeared unbroken. Roads were safe, markets thrived, taxes were collected. The king's authority seemed unquestioned. But illusion is fragile. The stability that Canute had created was personal, not institutional. Without his presence, the delicate balance between loyalty, fear, and justice faltered. Nobles whispered, alliances shifted, and authority became conditional. England had survived Canute's death, but it had not inherited his control over the human element that bound kingdoms together. This is a lesson that echoes across history. Functional systems may appear strong, but when they rely on one individual, fragility hides behind everyday order. The 1050s revealed the limitations of borrowed stability. England remained prosperous, but cracks widened. Nobles tested limits quietly. Minor disputes lingered. Regional autonomy grew subtly. Canute's successors lacked the balance and foresight to manage the underlying tensions. Though outwardly calm, England was edging toward the challenges that would culminate in the Norman conquest a decade later. The lessons of Canute's reign, the need for durable institutions, clear succession, and balanced authority, were forgotten. The kingdom had learned the dangers of relying on a single mind to hold it together. Canute's genius was both his strength and the seed of future vulnerability. His empire thrived while he lived, yet his absence revealed its dependence on him. The quiet years following his death foreshadowed the turbulence to come. Canute's rule left England with more than territory. He left an administrative model, trade networks, religious influence, and a framework for legal authority. These contributions shaped English governance for decades. Monarchs who followed inherited systems designed to function efficiently. Yet these systems were not self-sustaining. Without the guiding hand of Canute, they relied on the competence of individual rulers. England experienced periods of calm, but also subtle instability. The lesson was clear. Institutions could support a kingdom, but only if leaders wielded them with skill and foresight. Canute's impact on trade, culture, and religion endured beyond politics. Markets remained active. Monasteries flourished. Cities prospered. The North Sea became a conduit of commerce and ideas. Yet prosperity could not substitute for strong governance. The structures that allowed these achievements to flourish depended on oversight, negotiation, and balance. Without Canute, England's outwardly thriving economy and cultural networks concealed underlying vulnerabilities. Success persisted, but coherence had diminished. Canute's reign teaches a subtle truth. Achievements can outlast a ruler, but stability requires both systems and capable leadership. One without the other is temporary. Canute the Great remains one of history's most fascinating rulers. His reign combined conquest, governance, diplomacy, and vision. He controlled 3 kingdoms with authority, wisdom, and subtlety. Yet the brilliance of his personal rule also carried a warning. Empires built on one mind cannot endure without institutional support. England, after Canute, continued to function. Trade thrived, laws persisted, culture flourished. But the kingdom was fragile, dependent on individuals rather than systems. Nobles acted cautiously, loyalties shifted, minor fractures invisible to most widened silently. The lesson is timeless. Brilliance can stabilize, inspire, and create prosperity, but permanence demands structure, succession, and institutions capable of outliving the individual. Canute's story is not only a tale of conquest and governance. It is a reflection on the delicate balance between personal authority and enduring systems. For England, his death was the start of a quiet unraveling, a slow drift that would eventually shape the crises of the late 11th century. Yet the genius of Canute the Great remains undeniable, a masterclass in leadership, vision, and the ephemeral nature of human power. By the early 1050s, England appeared orderly. Roads were patrolled, markets operated smoothly, taxes were collected, and justice was delivered. Outwardly, it was a kingdom at peace, but beneath this surface, authority was fragile. Canute's successors could maintain compliance, but the subtle cohesion he had forged through personal judgment and presence was gone. Nobles whispered, alliances shifted, and local leaders quietly tested boundaries. Decisions once centralized now moved slowly, weighed down by caution and self-interest. England was functional, but brittle, a kingdom held together by habit rather than mastery. The illusion of control masked the slow drift toward instability, a drift that would shape the events leading to 1066. Without Canute's presence, the nobility grew independent. Earls and local leaders exercised influence quietly, testing limits without open rebellion. Loyalties were conditional, negotiated pragmatically, rather than stemming from respect or admiration. The kingdom was technically unified, but politically fragmented. This fragmentation was invisible to most citizens. Life went on, markets thrived, towns prospered, yet the subtle cracks in authority had long-term consequences. England's future rulers would inherit not just a wealthy, functional kingdom, but a web of fragile loyalties, where the wrong move could spark conflict. Canute's vision extended beyond conquest. He had created a connected North Sea network, linking England, Denmark, and Norway through trade, diplomacy, and shared influence. This network endured beyond his death, sustaining commerce, cultural exchange, and relative prosperity. Yet even trade revealed fragility. Delays, local disputes, and regional autonomy began to erode efficiency. Ships still sailed, merchants still traded, but coordination depended on negotiation rather than authority. Canute's genius had ensured smooth networks through oversight and personal authority. Without him, function persisted, but cohesion faltered. Religion remained one of the few constants. Canute had strengthened ties with the church, ensuring clergy supported his rule and mediated disputes. After his death, this network continued to stabilize the kingdom. Monks recorded laws, religious leaders advised nobles, and faith offered a sense of continuity. Yet even the church could not replace judgment. Clergy provided legitimacy, but could not enforce the unity Canute had imposed. England's governance relied on presence, negotiation, and foresight, all absent in the post-Canute era. The kingdom functioned, but its foundation was shifting. Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut's succession disputes were subtle but impactful. Harold had filled the void after Canute's death, acting as the visible authority. Harthacnut's later arrival restored legitimacy, but tension lingered. Nobles aligned pragmatically, hedging loyalties depending on the ruler's presence. This quiet instability spread throughout England. Governance became reactive rather than strategic. Canute's successors maintained order, but they lacked his foresight and balance. Authority existed, but cohesion was diminished. England survived, but it no longer thrived as a unified entity. Without Canute's guiding hand, regional leaders grew bolder. Earls and lords exercised influence quietly, resolving disputes locally rather than deferring to the king. Decisions that once required central approval became decentralized, and loyalty became conditional. These subtle shifts were invisible to most citizens, but they weakened the kingdom's cohesion. The systems Canute had built remained, but they functioned on inertia and fear, not judgment. England's prosperity persisted, but fragility increased with every passing year. England appeared peaceful, roads were patrolled, markets thrived. Taxes were collected, citizens went about their lives unaware of the cracks forming in governance. Canute's successors projected authority, yet beneath the surface, compliance was cautious and conditional. This illusion of peace masked growing instability. Nobles tested limits quietly. Regional autonomy expanded. The kingdom's outward stability hid vulnerabilities that would later be tested. Canute's brilliance had created cohesion through personal authority. His absence revealed the fragility of that approach. Canute's North Sea network remained operational, connecting England, Denmark, and Norway. Trade continued. Diplomacy persisted. Cities prospered. His vision had created a functional empire, yet the system's fragility was evident. Without Canute's oversight, coordination faltered. Local disputes slowed commerce. Nobles acted independently. Alliances were conditional. The network functioned, but its cohesion depended on pragmatism, not authority. Canute had held it together personally. His successors managed it reactively. The cracks in post-Canute England were subtle but profound. Nobles hedged loyalties. Authority was reactive. Local leaders asserted independence quietly. England remained outwardly calm, but the foundations of power were weakening. These years foreshadowed the upheaval to come. By the 1060s, England would face challenges that exposed the fragility of a kingdom built on personal authority rather than institutional strength. Canute's reign had been brilliant but impermanent. His successors maintained function, but not cohesion. The kingdom survived, yet its vulnerabilities would define the next chapter of English history. Canute the Great remains a study in brilliance and fragility. He controlled 3 kingdoms, balancing authority, law, fear, and foresight. His reign was a masterclass in governance, yet his empire's dependence on him revealed a universal truth. Personal genius cannot replace sustainable institutions. England survived after his death, but the kingdom's cohesion was diminished. Prosperity persisted, trade flourished, laws remained. Yet authority was conditional and loyalty transactional. Canute's successors ruled, but they lacked the subtle judgment and presence that had made his empire function seamlessly. the lesson endures. Brilliance can stabilize and inspire, but permanence requires systems, institutions, and foresight. England's experience after Canute foreshadowed the crises of the late 11th century, including the Norman conquest. The brilliance of one ruler can achieve extraordinary things, but history rewards durable structures, not individuals. Canute's story is not just a tale of conquest, governance, or diplomacy. It is a reflection on the delicate balance between authority and resilience, presence and permanence. His legacy persists in the systems he left behind, the trade he connected, and the lessons history continues to teach. By the late 1050s, England, Denmark, and Norway were still outwardly stable, but the cohesion that Canute had cultivated was eroding. His successors maintained the appearance of authority, yet the personal presence that had held the kingdoms together was gone. Markets operated, roads remained safe, taxes were collected, nobles obeyed but only selectively and only where it served their interests. The illusion of a unified empire persisted, masking subtle fractures. Local leaders acting independently, loyalties shifting quietly, and minor disputes lingering unresolved. Canute had built an empire on skill, foresight, and presence. His successors inherited the structures, not the brilliance. The North Sea world continued to function, but the foundation was fragile, and history shows that such fragility eventually demands reckoning. Canute's vision for trade endured. The North Sea network connected England, Denmark, and Norway. Merchants traveled, ports thrived, and coastal cities prospered. The economy reflected Canute's foresight, a legacy of organization and connectivity. Yet even here, fragility appeared. Delays in trade, regional disputes, and the autonomy of local lords slowed efficiency. Canute's oversight had ensured smooth coordination. Without him, the network continued, but at the cost of cohesion. The empire functioned, but its strength relied on inertia, not authority. The church remained a cornerstone of post-Canute stability. Canute's patronage had strengthened monasteries, religious leaders, and scholars, making faith a source of legitimacy for rulers after him. Clergy mediated disputes, recorded laws, and guided local governance. But even religion had limits. Clergy could influence loyalty and provide continuity, but they could not enforce unity or replace strategic judgment. England remained orderly, yet the cohesion Canute had achieved through personal authority was absent. Faith alone could not substitute for leadership, it could only support it. In the absence of Canute's unifying presence, regional leaders quietly asserted themselves. Earls and local rulers exercised influence independently, making decisions once reserved for the king. Authority became more transactional, based on immediate advantage rather than loyalty or long-term vision. These subtle shifts did not provoke immediate conflict, but they weakened the kingdom's structural integrity. England remained outwardly prosperous, but each independent decision eroded centralized cohesion. Canute's successors preserved function, but they could not restore unity. For citizens, England seemed calm, roads were safe, markets flourished, justice was served. The crown's authority appeared unquestioned, but the illusion of stability hid a critical truth: power had become conditional. Canute had balanced fear, loyalty, and justice with subtle mastery. His successors enforced authority through reaction and presence alone, leaving cohesion fragile. Nobles hedged loyalties, local leaders acted independently, and minor disputes simmered quietly. The kingdom's outward stability could not mask the underlying fragility. This illusion is a reminder that a kingdom's endurance relies not only on wealth or law, but on cohesion, trust, and competent authority. Canute's reign had left England enriched culturally and economically. Monasteries flourished, literacy expanded, and the North Sea trade network thrived. Coastal cities benefited from increased commerce, while cultural exchange linked Scandinavia and England in new ways. Yet these achievements could not ensure political stability. Local disputes slowed trade, nobles acted independently, coordination faltered, prosperity persisted, but cohesion weakened. Canute's genius had ensured smooth, interconnected networks. His successors maintained function, but not harmony. The legacy was paradoxical. England was wealthier and more connected than ever, yet authority was fragile. Prosperity alone could not sustain unity. Canute's brilliance had created a system, but it required his presence to function seamlessly. The subtle instability of post-Canute England foreshadowed future upheaval. Nobles hedged loyalties, local leaders acted independently, authority had become conditional. The kingdom remained outwardly calm, but the seeds of future crises were already sown. By the 1060s, these fractures would contribute to political instability, setting the stage for external threats and internal power struggles. Canute's brilliance had held the empire together, but his absence revealed a fundamental truth. Empires built on one ruler's authority are vulnerable to decay. The quiet years following his death masked tension, but history shows that such fragility never remains hidden for long. Canute's reign illustrates the power and limits of personal authority. He ruled 3 kingdoms with foresight, balance, and decisiveness. His successors inherited wealth, trade, and infrastructure, but they lacked his judgment and presence. Authority is fragile when dependent on one person. Canute had maintained cohesion through personal skill. His successors maintained appearances without substance. England survived, but the cracks deepened. Function persisted, but unity eroded. The brilliance of one man had achieved extraordinary results, but impermanence was inevitable. Even as political cohesion weakened, Canute's cultural and economic legacies endured. Monasteries preserved knowledge. Trade continued across the North Sea. Coastal cities thrived. Faith provided continuity and legitimacy, yet cultural resilience could not replace governance. Prosperity persisted, but authority had become conditional, loyalty transactional. England functioned outwardly, but the subtle fractures revealed the limits of Canute's approach. Institutions alone could not hold an empire together without capable leadership. Canute the Great remains one of history's most compelling figures. He ruled 3 kingdoms with skill, foresight, and subtle authority. His empire prospered, trade networks flourished, and cultural connections expanded. Yet his story is also a warning. Personal brilliance can achieve extraordinary feats, but it cannot guarantee permanence. England survived after his death, but cohesion was weakened, authority conditional, and loyalty transactional. His successors inherited function, not genius. The lessons endure. Prosperity alone cannot sustain a kingdom. Authority requires judgment, foresight, and durable institutions. Canute's reign demonstrates the delicate balance between personal skill and lasting structures. His empire functioned brilliantly under him, but fragility lay just beneath the surface. History rewards foresight and institution building over individual brilliance alone. Canute's legacy is a reminder that while one ruler can shape an era, the permanence of their achievements depends on the systems they leave behind. In understanding Canute the Great, we see both the heights of human governance and the limits of relying on personal authority. His story resonates across centuries, teaching that leadership is as much about the structures one leaves behind as the victories one achieves. By the early 1060s, England seemed calm, orderly, and prosperous. Roads were patrolled, markets thrived, taxes were collected, and citizens followed the law. From the outside, it was a kingdom at peace. But beneath the surface, the balance Canute had maintained was unraveling. Nobles had grown accustomed to acting independently. Loyalties were pragmatic, not loyal. Disputes simmered quietly in the shadows. Minor rebellions, previously quelled through subtle judgment, were now resolved only reactively. England functioned, but cohesion was fading. Canute's successors maintained authority, but they lacked the subtlety and foresight that had allowed him to unify 3 kingdoms. His empire survived, but it did not thrive. The brilliance of one man had left a lasting mark, but without the structures to support it, fragility quietly took root. Without Canute's presence, regional leaders grew increasingly autonomous. Earls and lords negotiated their loyalties depending on circumstance rather than principle. Authority had become conditional, based on fear, personal gain, and immediate advantage. For ordinary citizens, life remained unchanged. Markets thrived, towns operated smoothly, and the crown appeared strong. Yet the kingdom's political cohesion was slowly eroding. Small disputes between nobles went unresolved. Alliances shifted subtly. Decisions that once required central guidance were made locally, often at the expense of broader stability. The genius of Canute had been in managing these human variables. He balanced ambition, fear, loyalty, and diplomacy. His successors inherited wealth and infrastructure but lacked the judgment that had made authority real. England survived, but the cracks were widening. Even as political cohesion faltered, Canute's economic vision endured. The North Sea trade network remained active, connecting England, Denmark, and Norway. Merchants traveled safely. Coastal cities flourished. Goods and ideas flowed across the empire. Yet this prosperity was increasingly dependent on inertia rather than authority. Disputes delayed shipments. Local rulers negotiated loyalties instead of following centralized oversight. The infrastructure Canute had created remained functional, but without his presence, cohesion weakened. The empire could survive economically, but subtle fractures persisted. England was wealthier and more connected than ever, yet prosperity alone could not maintain unity. Canute had created a system that required oversight to function optimally. His successors maintained outward function, but the bonds of authority were fraying quietly beneath the surface. Canute's alliance with the Church remained one of the few stabilizing forces in England. Monks and clergy mediated disputes, recorded laws, and maintained the legitimacy of the crown. Faith offered continuity in a world where political cohesion was faltering, yet the Church alone could not enforce unity. Its authority provided moral guidance, but it could not replicate Canute's judgment or presence. England was orderly, but the subtle cracks in governance were growing. The kingdom relied increasingly on institutions without their guiding force, a precarious balance that history would soon challenge. Regional leaders grew bolder. Earls exercised influence quietly, resolving disputes locally rather than deferring to the king. Authority became transactional. Compliance existed only where it served immediate interests. These subtle shifts were invisible to most citizens, but they weakened the kingdom's structural integrity. England remained outwardly prosperous, yet each independent decision chipped away at cohesion. Canute's successors could enforce law, but not unity. Fragility had replaced genius. Citizens saw only calm. Roads were safe. Markets thrived, taxes were collected. Life appeared unchanged. The crown's authority seemed unquestioned, but beneath the surface, subtle fractures persisted. Nobles hedged loyalties. Local leaders acted independently. Minor disputes lingered. England's outward stability masked an erosion of centralized authority. Canute's brilliance had held the kingdom together through presence, judgment, and subtle diplomacy. His successors maintained appearances but not cohesion. The lesson is timeless. True stability depends on more than wealth or law. It depends on balance, foresight, and capable leadership. England was surviving, but it was walking a precarious path. Even as governance weakened, Canute's cultural and economic legacies persisted. Monasteries flourished, literacy expanded, and the North Sea trade network connected England to Scandinavia and beyond. Coastal cities prospered and cultural exchange flourished, yet prosperity could not compensate for fragility in governance. Local disputes slowed trade. Nobles acted independently. Coordination faltered. Canute's genius had ensured smooth, interconnected networks. His successors maintained function, but not harmony. England remained outwardly wealthy and cultured, yet cohesion weakened. This paradox highlights a central theme of Canute's story. Personal brilliance can create extraordinary results, but without enduring institutions, cohesion is temporary. The subtle instability of England in the 1060s foreshadowed the dramatic upheaval of 1066. Nobles hedged loyalties. Regional autonomy quietly expanded. Authority had become conditional. The kingdom appeared calm, but the cracks were visible to those paying attention. Canute's successors had maintained order, yet they lacked the presence and judgment that had held three kingdoms together. England survived, but underlying tensions were growing. The stage was set for conflict. The lessons of Canute's reign, the need for durable institutions, clear succession, and balanced authority, were ignored. The quiet years after his death would shape the destiny of the kingdom in ways no one at the time could fully perceive. Canute's reign demonstrates both the power and limits of personal authority. He controlled three kingdoms with foresight, strategy, and presence. His successors inherited wealth, infrastructure, and systems, but not his judgment or genius. Authority is fragile when dependent on one person. Canute's successors maintained outward function, yet the cohesion he had created was gone. England survived, but cracks deepened. Prosperity persisted, but unity eroded. Canute achieved extraordinary results, but impermanence was inevitable. His story teaches a timeless lesson. Stability requires institutions, foresight, and skilled leadership. Personal brilliance alone cannot guarantee the enduring cohesion of a kingdom. Canute the Great remains one of history's most compelling rulers. His reign combined conquest, diplomacy, governance, and vision. He ruled three kingdoms with subtle authority, foresight, and balance, leaving behind trade networks, cultural achievements, and a legacy of order. Yet his story is also a warning. Personal brilliance can stabilize kingdoms and inspire loyalty, but it cannot ensure permanence. England survived after his death, but cohesion weakened. Authority became conditional. Loyalties were transactional. His successors inherited structures, but not the genius that had maintained them. The lesson endures across centuries. Prosperity, culture, and law are insufficient without enduring institutions and competent leadership. Canute's brilliance created extraordinary results, but impermanence was inevitable. Understanding Canute the Great is not just a study of conquest and governance. It is a reflection on the delicate balance between personal skill and institutional endurance. His legacy teaches that the strength of a kingdom lies not only in its wealth or military power, but in the cohesion, foresight, and structures that survive beyond a single ruler's presence. By the mid-1060s, England's outward calm masked a quiet, creeping instability. Canute's successors had maintained law, trade, and religion, yet the personal presence that once united three kingdoms was gone. Nobles acted independently, alliances were conditional, local disputes lingered longer than they should. The kingdom survived through inertia and fear, not through cohesion or respect. England had inherited Canute's structures, but not the subtle authority that made them effective. Authority had become transactional, compliance conditional, and loyalty a matter of convenience. This slow drift would culminate in the dramatic events of 1066. Canute's genius had held the North Sea world together, yet its fragility was always lurking beneath the surface. The kingdom remained functional, yet its underlying fractures foreshadowed upheaval. Without Canute, centralized authority weakened. Regional leaders exercised influence quietly, resolving disputes locally and asserting autonomy. Nobles hedged loyalties, deciding when and where to comply. Ordinary citizens experienced little immediate change, but the subtle erosion of centralized power was profound. Where Canute had balanced fear, loyalty, and justice with subtle skill, his successors relied on reaction and brute force. England survived, but cohesion was fraying. This period demonstrates a critical lesson. Empires built on one ruler's personal authority are inherently fragile. Canute's death revealed the hidden tensions that his genius had previously contained, setting the stage for future conflict. Even as political cohesion faltered, Canute's economic and cultural legacy endured. The North Sea trade network remained active, linking England, Denmark, and Norway. Coastal cities prospered. Monasteries preserved knowledge. Literacy spread, ideas flowed across the empire, yet the network's resilience relied on habit and momentum rather than centralized authority. Delays and local disputes began to hinder trade. Nobles acted independently. Coordination weakened. England remained prosperous outwardly, but cohesion had diminished. Canute's genius had created smooth, interconnected networks. His successors preserved function but not harmony. The paradox was clear. The brilliance of one man had created extraordinary prosperity, yet the kingdom's cohesion was fragile. Personal authority had held the system together. Without it, fragility surfaced silently but persistently. Religion remained a stabilizing force. Canute had forged strong ties with the church, and clergy continued to mediate disputes and advise nobles. Faith offered legitimacy and a sense of continuity amid political fragility. Yet moral authority could not substitute for strategic leadership. Clergy could influence loyalty and provide guidance, but they could not enforce unity across three kingdoms. England's institutions survived, but the subtle cohesion Canute had maintained through presence and judgment had vanished. The kingdom operated, yet it relied on structures without their guiding genius, a precarious balance that would not last indefinitely. As Canute's personal authority faded from memory, regional leaders quietly expanded their autonomy. Earls acted independently, negotiating loyalties based on self-interest rather than principle. Minor disputes lingered. Conditional compliance became the norm. Ordinary citizens experienced stability, but the kingdom's structural integrity eroded. Canute had balanced ambition, fear, and diplomacy to maintain unity. His successors maintained law, but not cohesion. The outward appearance of stability persisted, yet subtle fractures spread through the political fabric. This period teaches a profound lesson. Systems can survive one ruler's absence only if the institutions are resilient, the succession clear, and leadership skillful. England's drift illustrates the danger of over-reliance on personal authority. For the population, life seemed calm, markets thrived, roads were safe, taxes were collected, the crown appeared strong, yet the illusion of peace hid deeper tensions. Nobles tested limits, alliances shifted, and minor disputes simmered. Canute's genius had maintained cohesion through judgment, foresight, and personal authority. His successors relied on force, reaction, and institutions alone. The kingdom survived outwardly, but the subtle cracks in governance foreshadowed future upheaval. England's story demonstrates a timeless truth: stability is more than appearances. Prosperity, law, and order are insufficient without capable leadership and durable institutions. The slow unraveling of authority after Canute foreshadowed the dramatic changes of 1066. Nobles hedged loyalties, local leaders acted independently, and central authority had weakened. Outward stability masked underlying fragility. England remained prosperous, but cohesion had diminished. Canute's successors maintained function, but not harmony. The subtle fractures in governance, loyalty, and regional autonomy would soon define the kingdom's destiny. The brilliance of one ruler had preserved unity. Its absence revealed vulnerabilities waiting to be tested. History demonstrates the limits of personal authority. It can achieve extraordinary results, but sustainability requires institutions and foresight. Canute's empire functioned brilliantly under him, yet the seeds of future instability were sown the moment he passed. Canute's story is a study in both the power and limits of individual genius. He ruled 3 kingdoms with foresight, skill, and authority. His successors inherited wealth, infrastructure, and culture, but not judgment or personal authority. England survived, but cracks deepened. Prosperity persisted, yet unity eroded. Canute had achieved brilliance, but impermanence was inevitable. The kingdom's stability relied on one man. Once he was gone, fragility emerged quietly, unseen by ordinary citizens but felt by those navigating power. The lesson is clear: personal brilliance can achieve extraordinary outcomes, but sustainability requires systems, institutions, and leadership capable of outliving the individual. England would learn this lesson again in the decades to come. Even as political authority waned, Canute's cultural and economic achievements endured. Monasteries thrived, trade continued across the North Sea, cities prospered, literacy and learning flourished. Yet prosperity could not substitute for leadership. Regional disputes slowed trade, nobles acted independently, coordination faltered. The empire remained outwardly functional, but cohesion had diminished. Canute had created extraordinary networks that relied on his presence to operate seamlessly. Without him, function persisted, but harmony did not. The paradox of Canute's legacy is striking. Brilliance created wealth, order, and culture, yet without institutions reinforced by capable leadership, fragility eventually surfaced. Canute the Great remains one of history's most remarkable rulers. He conquered 3 kingdoms, balanced authority with foresight, and created networks of trade, culture, and governance that endured beyond his reign. His brilliance left a lasting imprint on England, Denmark, and Norway. Yet his story is also a cautionary tale. Personal brilliance can stabilize empires, but permanence depends on institutions, foresight, and capable leadership. England survived after his death, but cohesion weakened, authority became conditional, and loyalty was transactional. His successors inherited structures, but not the genius that maintained them. The lessons of Canute's reign endure. Stability requires more than wealth, law, or order. It requires judgment, presence, and resilient systems. Canute achieved extraordinary results, yet impermanence was inevitable. Understanding Canute is not merely a study of conquest or governance. It is a reflection on the delicate balance between personal skill and institutional endurance. His empire functioned brilliantly under his guidance, yet history shows that the longevity of achievement depends on structures that survive beyond a single ruler. Canute's story resonates across centuries, teaching that leadership is as much about the systems one leaves behind as the victories one achieves. His legacy is a masterclass in brilliance, fragility, and the enduring lessons of human governance. Canute the Great was far more than a conqueror. He was a ruler of extraordinary vision, a man who held three kingdoms together through foresight, diplomacy, and a subtle, commanding presence. Under his reign, England, Denmark, and Norway experienced order, flourishing trade, and cultural growth. For a brief moment, he shaped the destiny of nations with unmatched skill and clarity of purpose. Yet Canute's story also serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of personal authority. His empire relied on his judgment, his presence, and his ability to enforce cohesion. Once he passed, the systems he left behind persisted, but the unity that had made them effective began to unravel. Nobles tested boundaries, regional power quietly expanded, and loyalty became conditional rather than instinctive. Prosperity and culture remained, but the invisible thread holding the kingdoms together had weakened. The legacy of Canute the Great transcends time. Brilliance can stabilize, inspire, and achieve the extraordinary, but enduring influence demands more than genius. It requires institutions, foresight, and the careful stewardship of power. Canute's life remains a masterclass in leadership, a story of vision, fragility, and the delicate balance between authority and the resilience of the systems it governs.